We now turn our attention in this second half hour to Capitol Hill, which remains deeply divided after Tuesday's election. Republicans are holding on to their Senate majority, but it's not a done deal with runoff races on the horizon in Georgia. And in the House, Democrats remain in the majority, but Republicans gain seats, giving them more power as former Vice President Joe Biden moves closer to the White House. Joining me to discuss the new Congress are four of Washington's best reporters. Mitch, White House correspondent for the PBS NewsHour, joining us from the White House. Peter Baker, chief White House correspondent for the New York Times. Susan Davis, congressional correspondent for National Public Radio and co-host of the NPR Politics podcast. And we welcome now Jake Sherman, senior writer for Politico and co-author of Politico's Playbook. Welcome to all of you. Jake, if Vice President Biden is in the White House next year, it's President Biden. He'll maybe have Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell down Pennsylvania Avenue. It could be a Biden-McConnell-Washington. What would that look like? What would that mean for D.C. and the political dynamics?
Well, Bob, we have some framework for that because Joe Biden and Mitch McConnell have worked together for many years. Actually, during the Obama administration, Joe Biden was the unofficial liaison to Capitol Hill when Barack Obama couldn't get deals with Mitch McConnell. But a few thoughts to keep in mind here. Number one, the House majority is going to be Democratic, but very narrow. And with a Democrat in the White House, Nancy Pelosi and her team should expect that they will lose seats in their first midterm with a Democratic president in the White House. So that makes that dynamic tough. So then you switch over to Mitch McConnell. Mitch McConnell acts out of both substance but also political expediency, as we all know, as every politician does. And Mitch McConnell will be forced to work with Joe Biden, not because any other reason, but the nation needs a lot of help at this moment, needs a lot of legislating. There's going to be more COVID relief to be done, and Joe Biden's going to focus on infrastructure and things of that nature. Mitch McConnell can work with Joe Biden. He doesn't find him difficult to work with as he did Barack Obama and to some degree Donald Trump. So I think it has the makings of a fruitful relationship when their political incentives line up, and they will not always line up. But I would expect that there is going to be deal-making between Mitch McConnell and Joe Biden.
Sue, what are your sources in the Senate telling you? Because there was an Axios report this week that McConnell's ready to block Biden's nominees if he sees them as too liberal. Is this a McConnell who's ready to work with the President Biden, should that be the case, or ready to block a President Biden?
Well, I think it depends, right? I think that's a very good point about nominees. I mean, the Senate is going to, and Republicans in the Senate are going to see themselves as a check on Joe Biden's ability to fill his cabinet with people they might see as otherwise objectionable, people that might be too progressive or too left. I think are easily going to see much more of a fight coming from Republicans. I agree with Jake, though. I do think that there is certainly room here for compromise. And if you look back at the times that Biden and McConnell were able to work together, they were generally came about in times of crisis or at times of deadline when they had no other choice and a deal had to be cut and the two were able to do it. It wasn't about sort of grand legislating. It was about solving problems. And right now, we're in a national crisis. We're in the middle of a crisis that still requires ongoing legislative work. So I think both of them look at that and recognize that they don't have a choice in some regard on what they're going to have to do. This government is going to have to continue to address the pandemic and provide resources across the board to schools, to businesses, to the unemployed, that it's going to have to get done. Beyond that, you know, I don't think anybody looks at a divided Washington and sees it as likely to be some big grand breakthrough for major legislation. But I think on sort of smaller ball competence, keeping the government open, passing spending bills, doing coronavirus relief, there's certainly an ability for these two to be able to move an agenda through Congress.
Mitch, is there urgency, as Sue said, about this crisis the country's facing on the coronavirus? Economic relief has been lagging for months. And I talked to Governor Phil Murphy, a Democrat in New Jersey this week. He was pleading with Congress for state and local aid to try to deal with the virus as outbreaks happen in his state, in other states. Amid this political war, what is the state of stimulus talks, and could President Trump bend a little bit in the coming weeks?
from my understanding, the state of stimulus talks are that they've stopped entirely. Most people's attention, of course, is focused on the election, but in the United States, at least for the last 3 days, we've hit record highs when it comes to new cases of the coronavirus, with more than 100,000 Americans getting infected with the coronavirus per day. That's an incredible figure. It's also a figure that Dr. Fauci said was going to happen, and allies of the president called him alarmist. But then we've had the president who was trying to run for re-election by saying that the coronavirus was rounding the corner, that he was going to be getting a vaccine and therapeutics, and that he was really, that this was all something that people shouldn't be scared of. So there is this feeling, though, with all of the hurt that's happening, with millions of people out of work, with people getting evicted from their homes, with people dying across the country, that people need help. So at some point, you would think that the leaders in Washington would want to come together and do that. But it's going to be really hard, I think, if President Trump is continuing to launch legal battles, continuing to be, especially if he turns into a lame duck president, you can imagine that things are going to be even tougher when it comes to trying to get things done, because the president's attention before it was really not on the coronavirus. Now it's going to be even more not on the coronavirus as he thinks about his legacy.
Peter, my memory of Vice President Biden during the Obama years, which you covered so closely, was him ducking into McConnell's office on Capitol Hill. But he's also a presidential candidate, a potential president-elect right now, who's dealing with an ascendant left wing in the Democratic Party. What does a Biden, McConnell, Pelosi, Washington look like? Does it function? That's what so many people want to know. Could it function?
Well, I think it could function, but I don't know that it will be. I think this is the disappointing result, obviously, for progressives and liberals in the Democratic Party, who would imagine that the Democrats would take the Senate and there would be this opportunity for sweeping change, right? Things like court packing, forget that. Things like, sweeping climate change legislation or gun control or big health care plans. I can't imagine that happening at this point. It's going to be much more of a steady as she goes kind of situation, as everybody else has just been saying. I think that, McConnell and Biden have proven that they can do a steady as she goes kind of deals to keep things open and keep the ship state going forward. But there's not going to be a lot of ambition, it doesn't seem like, where the two of them can agree. So that, you're going to have a new president, if you do have in Joe Biden, who's going to have to turn to his executive power. We'll see the third president in a row, really, who begins to use that sole authority that a president has to advance his agenda over a recalcitrant Congress. One area where you could see President Biden do that, aside from things like the coronavirus, might be things like immigration. A lot of the things that President Trump has done to clamp down on immigration have been done through executive power, not through Congress. Well, Joe Biden can undo some of those things. Also, some of these environmental regulations that have been lifted through President Trump's EPA, they could begin to undo some of those things. He could get back into the Paris Climate Accord. But in terms of working with Congress, I would be hard-pressed to imagine, other than something like maybe infrastructure, anything of great sweeping ambition that could get through Congress led by Mitch McConnell, Nancy Pelosi, with Joe Biden in the White House.
And Sue,
Bob, could I just interject one thing here? I just want to make a point that all of us around the table understand, but people outside of our group might not understand. What we've been accustomed to, a president who says one thing in the morning and then changes his mind by midday, right? Like, Donald Trump never had a White House that was marching to the beat of the same drum. Joe Biden is not going to be that kind of president. Why? Because we know he's been in government for 40 years. Like, Donald Trump would send his emissaries to Capitol Hill. They'd cut a deal only to have Donald Trump reverse on it. That's not going to happen with Joe Biden. So from that very basic level, Washington is going to be at a much more normal pace. It's going to be much more calm. It's going to be much more efficient. I mean, we almost take that for granted at this point, that is not going to happen anymore. And that, for everybody, for markets, for political markets, for journalists, for members of Congress, those are all good dynamics that are going to calm, I think, people's nerves as we get into 2021 if Joe Biden is elected.